Go ahead.
Dan, did you have any announcements before?
Yeah, no. So thank you, Rick. So thank you so much for everyone who's participating today. Again, reminder, if you do have questions, please put those in the chat. And if we don't get to them today, we will definitely send them over to our speaker to see if he can answer those for our community. This is a growing community. This is the Activate New Mexico community. So thank you so much that are calling in from your homes. We hope you're home, that you're safe, and we're super happy that you're staying engaged with us. So this is a series called the Stay Engaged series, and Mark is our first mentor, and Rick, as well as one of our mentors, have put these talks on about product management. And next week we will be working on some funding resources for startups in New Mexico. They're really eligible for a lot of people, but we're going to go in deep about New Mexican resources. And so I'll be sure to send out a follow-up email with those links and resources as well. So again, thank you so much, and we'll pass it back over to Rick to kick us off with today's workshop.
Okay, thanks everyone. So this is the third session that we're having with Mark Berman. First one was the importance of product management for startup companies. The second one was a deeper dive into product management, where we looked at some prototyping tools and some other things that Mark has developed. And today we're basically having an Ask Me Anything session, starting with some of the questions that were referred to us by previous participants. If during the presentation you have questions that you'd rather not post in the Everyone section, then send them directly to me. I've also posted in the Everyone chat the survey that really appreciate if you completed right after the session. It should take you no more than 5 minutes, and it's very important in our efforts to continuously improve these kinds of programs. So with that, I will hand it over to Mark.
Thanks, Rick and Dan. Cool. So as Rick mentioned, for today's session, we've taken a number of your questions that you've shared with us, and using this as an opportunity to kind of share some thoughts on some topics that are top of mind for a number of you. As Rick and Dan mentioned, this isn't an exhaustive list. If you have any other questions, feel free to send them through, and hopefully we'll be able to tackle them today. And also hoping that we can try to keep this a bit interactive. So if others have feedback or questions or want to chime in, feel free to raise your hand or drop a message, and we can then proceed like that. So we're just going to tackle these first four, and then see if there are any others that pop up depending on time. So the first is around how to get feedback early from customers. So this was a question that came through, series of questions. I'll just kind of read them out. So how and when do you talk to a potential client for feedback, especially early when maybe you don't have a finished product? How do you get in the door without trying to come across salesy, especially when you're trying to get early feedback? What do you say to try to get their interest to even want to consider or share feedback with you? And how do you, encourage that willing dialogue? So some thoughts that I've just kind of put on the slide. Once again, not intended to be an exhaustive list, but based on experience from startups that I've founded, working with many startups out there, some things that I've seen work really well. As an example, how clear are your problem statements? And I guess what I'm getting at is, how well are you able to articulate something specific to either the domain or the problem or the space that you're going after, so that you can empathize with that end user. And coupled to that, it's how clear are your value propositions tied to those problem statements, and ideally with some kind of set of metrics so that it's, you know, very tangible and very actionable. Coupled to this is also how well do these problem statements not only talk to the domain or the specific customer space that you're going after, but maybe there's also competitive products that the folks that you're going after or the space that you're entering into, you know, maybe there are existing competitive products that you're trying to go after, and being able to understand and articulate how your offering is better than a competitor's offering is also, I think, a core part of some of those initial discussions. And more often than not, there are manual ways, as I'm sure most of you have experienced, there are manual ways of solving existing problems. How well do you understand those manual ways of solving existing problems? The thing that I've observed is that when, as a startup, and founders, when we get super clear about our problem statements and the value that we're providing to address those problem statements, it becomes very easy to have a dialogue with potential customers, because really you aren't selling, you're empathizing and connecting with real world problems that customers having. And more often than not, which often surprises new founders, customers in that type of situation are actually surprisingly willing to share a lot more than maybe you would have thought or considered. And I think a lot of it has to do with how well you connect to the problems that customer is having. And I think part of that voyage is also to then use it as an opportunity to validate how well you're articulating and hitting on you know, key problems and associated metrics in that space. So an example to share with you, I was working with a startup that was building a solution that helps connect farmers to buyers. In their initial hypothesis, they had posited that they're going to go after farmers. Why? Because it's a very fragmented world, and figuring out the supply chain from a buyer perspective in terms of forecasting and planning and inventory, they thought would be a no-brainer. And being able to, you know, go after those farmers would be a clear win-win for everyone. The interesting thing is, when they started having the initial discussions with some farmers, it turns out what they realized was that a lot of the buying actually happens at a group level. And more often than not, around the world, a lot of the group level buying happens through cooperatives, as I'm sure most of you have, you know, probably bought in some fashion or another, especially in the US, through some cooperative on the retail side. The same thing happens on the supply chain side. So had they not spoken to who they thought was their target audience, in this case farmers, and articulated what they thought was the problem statement and the associated value, they wouldn't have realized that the big kahuna is actually the cooperatives. Cooperatives have hundreds of farmers under them, and those cooperatives are the ones who are struggling to onboard new farmers, and also to deal with some of the contractual stuff, supply chain from a shipping perspective, all of the customs documentation and whatnot. And that led them onto a whole different set of problem statements that they hadn't necessarily prioritized in the way that they had initially prioritized. And I think that's where a lot of the opportunity in talking to customers really is in trying to unpack what you think the problem statements are and the associated value that you're bringing to address those problem statements. And then going through the exploratory phase of figuring out one, are these the right problem statements? Are we actually empathizing with that target audience? Do we have the priorities right? And then as part of that, I think there's also an important discussion to have, which is what or who does your ideal customer look like? In this example, the ideal customer initially were farmers, individual farmers. Through many, many months of discovery, it evolved to cooperatives. Initially, before they even started talking to farmers, they thought their customers would be buyers, the Nestle's of the world. But it turns out trying to get into that space is even more challenging than trying to go after cooperatives. So, so I think in many ways, you know, trying to just talk through these initial set of questions, you know, when do you talk to a potential customer? How do you get it in the door, and so on? I think a lot of this has to do with how well you're able to articulate the problems that's specific to these individuals. I think also as part of this, it's how do you incentivize these potential customers to provide feedback to you? So for example, if you're building whatever food widget, you know, maybe there's an opportunity to dangle a 3-month, 6-month, 12-month free use of whatever it is that you're building. Once again, if the potential customer sees value, that you're solving a problem that they can relate to, if it's going to save them money, save them time, save them resources, get them higher quality leads, all of the right checkboxes, if you're checking them, then a customer's naturally want to go get interested in helping to evolve and provide feedback. But then requiring them to pay for a product may put a lot of potential customers off. And like I say, having some kind of incentive, you know, where it's free to use the product, you know, could potentially be a win-win for everyone. And I'm sure you have creative ideas on incentivizing customers to provide feedback. Additionally, and I know I harped on this quite a lot in the last couple of sessions, but not to discount the huge power of wireframes. So in exactly the same scenario with the startup that was working with these farmers, what they had gone and done, which is very typical, is they had said, cool, I've got some hypothesis. Let's go and build a solution that goes after these hypotheses. So that's what they did. They spent months and months and months building the solution. They then went and they met with the supplier, the buyers. The buyers said, well, for these reasons, we actually can't buy from you. That then forced them to kind of reboot their strategy. In the meantime, they spent months and months and months building something. They then pivoted, built something for the farmers, met with the farmers. The farmers said, hang on, well, actually, we can't use your technology because we're really constrained by what the cooperative does. Now they've lost more time, I kid you not. They pivoted again, but by this stage, I was now involved. And as part of the discussion we had was, stop writing code and start getting into very detailed wireframes. And that's exactly what they did. They mocked up an end-to-end set of wireframes over a couple of days of what they think the experience from a value prop perspective would be for the cooperative, and got on some conference calls, chatted with those cooperatives, helped with the prioritization. The biggest one was around customs, dealing with customs. And that to them was quite a surprise, as they thought managing the farmers, managing the inventory that farmers have, and so on, figuring out scheduling of harvest, they thought that would be the priority. But from the cooperative's perspective, where they were spending most of the time and most of their effort was on dealing with customs for, you know, which varies by different country. So very quickly, as part of their wireframing experience, they evolved to present a set of user experiences that focus specifically on this problem statement for the cooperative. And within a week or two, they took the wireframes, evolved them into proto.io, doesn't matter what tool you use, but it was just an example of a tool that they used. They sent the cooperative a link, and the cooperative was then able to interactively basically play with the MVP, for lack of a better description, and provide real tangible feedback on whether or not the layout, the button sizes, the general flow, what was being captured, questions that were being asked, language, whether that actually validated the set of scenarios that they were going after. And within a very short period of time, like I say, they did that round trip within a couple of weeks. Only then did they start development. And the time to market was radically reduced because they had gone through this process of identifying who the ideal customer was, validating some of the problems that they were going after, and how they were going to go after them, so that it became a win-win for everyone involved. Any questions before I move on? Cool. Well, the next question is around pricing. How do you figure out whether or not to provide something for free, some kind of freemium offering, the basic versus premium decision-making process, and so on? So one of the tools that I've used in the past that is surprisingly effective, and this may not be black and white applicable in the space that you're going after, is using some kind of competitive matrix, where you list out the capabilities on the left, and then you identify the competitors on the right, and as well as your offering alongside the competitive offerings. And another good trick is to, even think from a roadmap perspective, what's coming first versus second versus third, and so on, as part of the release cycle. So this is just a very simple example where, maybe you're coming up with a, Dropbox competitor. So a matrix like this helps force the conversation of, enumerating the list of capabilities. So it forces you to actually go and look at the competitors' offerings, hopefully even get hands-on and play with the competitive offering. Enumerate the list of capabilities. Maybe, start highlighting, and this is just an example, there's, many other ways to cut and slice this problem. Start highlighting what's free versus what's paid. In this example, I just, said if you're entering into the space, pretty much everyone, offers some kind of, free storage quota. And let's say, Dropbox as the example is around 2 gig, but if you want anything more than 2 gigs, then that's typically paid. The same thing includes, having some type of desktop client to allow synchronization from your local machine to the cloud, as opposed to, what we did in the past, years ago, which was a website, that you had to log on and upload your files. This starts to talk to table stakes. So if you were to enter a market like this, you would have to be able to provide some free storage, in addition to some type of desktop client that allowed that synchronization from local to the cloud and vice versa. I think the conversation around free versus paid from a competitive perspective, the capabilities, in addition to table stakes versus differentiation, is a very useful exercise to go through using something like this. And oftentimes when new solutions are being thought up, there's usually multiple competitors that in a Venn diagram, if you use both, maybe provided a reasonably good solution. And that might be the space that you're going after, where you actually need those two things traditionally, whereas with your offering, it would just be a single offering, that would be cheaper and less cumbersome for end users to be able to use and not have to install or make use of multiple services and so on. And I think even in that example, listing out, multiple competitors and then, having some overlap between the two, there's nothing wrong with that. The same thing goes with listing out pricing. If you know your competitors provide certain things out of the box, table stakes, and differentiate in certain areas, it's also a very easy conversation to have when you're listing these out in some kind of table like this. And then using that as an opportunity for your own roadmap to then list out and score in some way how you might be competing in that regard. It might be as simple as just checks and crosses, or it might be, a little bit more involved where you provide some type of scoring. I'm a big fan of using some type of scorecard, which keeps you even more honest and also fosters conversation with fellow team members on why did you say something was good versus bad versus very good and so on. So maybe an area of differentiation that you're thinking about is providing, native integration with a specific application. Maybe you're going after a graphic designer audience and you want to provide a, slick integration with Photoshop or something like that. I'm just using this as an example. Maybe the primary competitor that you're going after doesn't have something like that. Okay. Maybe in your first version, you might have a somewhat kludgy offering, but at least it differentiates you, versus your competition. And over time, hopefully that gets good. Once again, another benefit with something like this is by listing out the different versions that are coming out, maybe, this year versus next year and so on. It also helps kind of orient some of the go-to-market speak. If you know that you're going to do a bad job in a certain area, then don't talk about it initially. Unless you're talking aspirationally about things to come, but often that could be misinterpreted by a certain audience that might want to adopt your offering and might put them off when they read that you've got certain capability, but when they actually use your solution, they then realize that the capability is actually pretty lacking. So I think this is another useful outcome of something like this, is being able to help with what are we going to talk about now versus in the future. Additionally, just kind of thinking about other things that you can do in terms of pricing is to think about what are the parts of your offering that have the highest cost. And funnily enough, this is often a topic that, at least from my experience, that I've seldom see covered by startups. What I'm getting at here is maybe you've rolled out a whole bunch of infrastructure to support some hypothesis of scale or geographic distribution and so on. And somewhere in there is most likely a cost for, whether it's for database infrastructure or some other, maybe you've got 20 instances running around the world. There's a cost that is probably going to be the greatest amount out of everything. Once we start to understand where the highest cost is, maybe there's an opportunity to think differently about how one might be able to monetize the thing that's costing the most. Alternatively, so, maybe it's storage. Like I say, on the database side, maybe allowing a customer to store a certain number of records is free, but once you go over a certain size, it becomes the thing that you get paid for. In the distributed scenario, I got 20 locations around the world, free maybe, I'm using a location that is not close to where I'm located as in terms of performance and whatnot, maybe it's, real far away. But if I wanted to have a location that's much closer to me, then maybe that's something that I have to pay. So I'm just using this as examples to try to stimulate a conversation on how could I think about pricing, free versus paid and so on. The next one is, what features are being used the most by your customers? And this comes into some of the conversation around analytics, where in the previous talks we said, if it was me, I would never release anything to customers unless there was some kind of analytics, because you want to be able to answer this question pretty much from day one. What are the things that customers are using the most? And what are they actually using the least? Figuring out the priority from a usage perspective on its own is actually a very valuable exercise. And even there might stimulate some dialogue on, well, it looks like, customers are using the reporting tool the most. Cool. So what if we didn't provide as granular reporting for the free user? Or what if we didn't provide as much historical data for the free user, but instead we limited it to only 2 reports and 1 week of data as an example? Would that encourage people to potentially consider paying as opposed to using free? Another area is around, have you actually asked your customers what they consider the most valuable, the most useful, and so on? And I think that's often where quantitative surveys are incredibly valuable, because we can ask questions in different ways to try to glean a set of observations that might point to what a customer deems valuable. And I think that's also just good surveying technique, is trying to hone in on asking the same question in different ways. One of the examples that I previously shared on one of the other sessions was with this desktop management or device management company that I was working with. The engineering team had made a set of assumptions that said, when we release, customers are going to want to support certain flavors of operating systems. Well, right there is a great way to be able to validate with customers, when do you think you'll need support for this specific version of operating system in this example? And I think the same can be applied to, to many things out there. Maybe you're building a solution that integrates with, some type of third-party data. You could ask, which of the third-party systems are most important to you? And of course, have another, for a way to capture things that maybe you have missed. How frequently do you want to be able to synchronize the data in that example? Real time, manually, every 24 hours, and so on. The next thing to explore is around what might be more important to you from a business perspective. And a lot of this is kind of talking to that Venn diagram that we showed, which kind of it expands upon the art of product management, which is, trying to balance what the business priorities are, what customers want, and then actually getting to market with something that is cost effective and so on. So,
hey, Mark.
Yep, go ahead.
Can we back up just a minute? And I want to ask, when you talk about the analytics and understanding which features are used by the customers, how do you do that? Do you use some client-side tools, external tools? How does it, or do you actually instrument the application?
I would say all of the above. More data, the better. Having said that, a lot of, like, from an instrumentation perspective, a lot of the cloud providers, the Azures and so on of the world, they've provided really awesome instrumentation tools, which you can plug in at a code level, which is really great for trying to figure out performance issues and whatnot. Maybe less useful when it comes to figuring out what people are using. Having said that, it is incredibly useful if you've done a good job abstracting out your user interface from some type of API middle tier layer, where your user interface is talking to a set of APIs. You start to get some good telemetry on what's being called the most, which hopefully validates some of the assumptions on what's being used the most, or at least could infer what's being used the most. I think from a web perspective, Google has done a great job on the analytics side in making it very easy to be able to track how customers got to your website and how they've traversed through your website and how they've exited your website. And they've also been doing a really good job on the mobile front, where you can now do something very similar, but you can actually do it across web and app. So the idea is I'm, mark.berman@outlook.com. I'm logged in through some way or another through Google, whether it's through, the Google account and so on. Being able to track what that user does, web versus browser, and have that consolidated experience is becoming more and more apparent in the world that we're in. And Google's been making huge strides in that space. Having said that, there's also tons of competitors out there that have, competing offerings to what Google provides. All that I'm sharing is that I would highly recommend, if there's anything that you're gonna pick right out of the box, I would highly recommend maybe going with Google first, and then as you learn and evolve your understanding of what some of the data can provide and how you might use the data, how you might create segments, how you might create goals and so on, things get pretty sophisticated pretty quickly. So the learning process is actually a pretty valuable thing. I think it's at that point that, it makes sense to then, look at third-party tools. And there are actually many third-party tools that provide overlays on top of Google Analytics data, primarily because a lot of what Google provides might not be the most intuitive or user-friendly from a reporting perspective. And that's part of the learning experience. And there are many third parties that try to make some of that easier. Like I said, for me personally, I've still found the biggest bang for your buck is just using, what's out of the box with Google Analytics. Surprisingly impressive.
Okay, thanks. That's great.
Sure. Carrying on with the other question is talking about, from a business perspective, what's more important, adoption versus revenue? And this is also a topic that I've seldom seen presented early on as part of business plans, business models, and so on. But I think this on its own is a very, very introspective conversation to potentially have. And what this talks about is adoption is really, we just need, 1 million users, daily active users, and let's get there as quickly as possible. Forget about making money. On the other side of the spectrum, it's we need to make money as quickly as possible. And if that means we get 1,000 or 10,000 users, so be it. Those are two very different worlds to be in. And I think also having that conversation, especially with colleagues, co-founders, fellow team members and whatnot, and being on the same page about that. Often it takes a lot of work just to get on the same page about just that topic. I think is very useful in informing questions around pricing strategy. If you're just going after adoption, great, we're all clear. We're not making money. until a certain milestone, let's be clear on that milestone. If you are making money, then that's very different. And then the conversation is, well, how are we going to monetize? We kind of talked about the next point a bit, and that's, being clear on table stakes versus, differentiators. I kind of like that matrix view because it's very clear if you've used the competitive product, what's on the list, what's considered table stakes if you're going to compete, which also helps from a costing perspective, just to get an MVP out that, competes purely from table stakes perspective is going to take us X amount of man days, versus, being able to differentiate. And then another question that, I thought is also worth exploring is, what's your exit strategy? Are you planning to be acquired by, a big kahuna or one of your competitors? Are you thinking about acquiring someone? Are you thinking about partnering? I think that on its own also helps inform, some thinking from a pricing perspective. An example there is, if you're gonna, I've worked with a bunch of companies in the past that have enterprise offerings, and they've looked at exits from a, big kahuna like a Microsoft or an Oracle perspective. And one of the first questions that I ask is, how well does your pricing strategy align with one of these, big kahunas? And some have, very clear black and white answers that their pricing strategy is very complementary. Others don't. So I think that's all. You may not get to a clear black and white answer, but I think a number of these questions are about provoking a dialogue to get fellow colleagues around the table to at least agree where you can, and use what at that moment in time, to put a stake in the ground that says, these are the assumptions that we're making, and these are the reasons why, and we're all on the same page about it. And then in 3 months, 6 months, whatever, as you learn more, you come back, evolve. And that's another thing that I've experienced is that pricing tends to be one of the hardest, if not the hardest topic, when it comes to talking about the the life cycle of a product. And I think having these deep conversations as soon as possible is important, but I think also not being too prescriptive about a pricing strategy, rather be a bit more flexible. I've often seen as a very smart way to play it, because more often than not, whatever you think is the way that you're going to monetize, I would say 9 out of 10 times, I've pretty much seen that change.
Hey, Mark, we have a question from Brian.
Yeah.
I think maybe the easiest thing to do would be to let him present it, but it has to do with how to balance between existing clients who are paying you and they expect new features based probably on what you've told them in the past. And on the other hand, you're interested in getting the product out for large-scale adoption. So, Brian, did you want to, I don't know that I paraphrased you correctly or not?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, it's basically your revenue versus market share to the extreme, where we have a single client that's paying us to build a product that we own, and we want to market that and to bring it out to more and more people. But their incentive is to continue to develop this for their needs. I've tried to incentivize them by offering them, hey, if we get these revenue milestones, then your development costs will be paid back. And if we get 5 other customers, you'll get this for free. Things like that, because they're sort of like investors, but it's a different. Their incentives are different, because an investor would want to scale it as quickly as possible, and they want to have their needs met as quickly as possible, and they're not super concerned with scaling. So it's a little bit different, because we've answered a lot of the product discovery, the customer questions, but it's that market share versus revenue balance, but to the complete extreme.
Yeah, I think what you share is a very common scenario that startups deal with. One of the companies that I had worked with We're building a big data offering that effectively took it effectively took a lot of what could be viewed as personal information, voter registration, integration with a number of banks and so on, as a way to kind of map out buying behavior and so on, potential buying behavior. And there are many companies that do exactly this. Some who have gotten into a lot of trouble. The problem that they had, much like the problem that you articulated, is they had one customer in particular that was paying all the bills and effectively funding a lot of the work. And the question that I had with the CEO at the time was, what happens when that customer is done with you? What happens when they find a competitive offering out there? What happens when they build something on their own? If they're even able to build something on their own. Primarily because, well, at least from a conversation perspective, we were trying to figure out how easy is it for someone to enter into the space, versus how much of what you're doing is really, your secret sauce. So the conversation became, are you a consulting business or are you a product business?
Yeah.
And in a roundtable discussion, and they invited their investor which was, I think, super interesting. We had a very constructive conversation on the pros and cons versus a consulting business versus a product business. The end result was you can't be both. What you can do, though, is you can use the consulting business to get you to a certain, as you say, milestone. And at that point, it becomes the hard conversation with the number one customer that's been paying all the bills up until that point, to then say, we're kind of shifting directions. And that was the approach they took. They said, we can't shift the product just yet for these various reasons. We're going to try to productize as much as possible while we're working with this customer, effectively having them pay the bills.
Yep.
And once we've reached whatever these milestones are, we're agreeing that we're potentially going to lose this revenue, or our revenue is going to radically decline as we shift to a more product-centric focus.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. The other perspective is, I've seen a lot of businesses actually create two distinct business units. One is a pure consulting business, and one is the product business. The problem with that, though, which I've seen time and time again, is the consulting business ends up forking a lot of what the product business is doing, which means they end up creating a branch of whatever the source code is, adding whatever needs to be added for that high priority customer, and not necessarily merging that functionality back into the main software release cycle, because no one else cares, no one else needs that. And I think that becomes a problem that starts to really surface, when you're a year, 2 years into it. Now you've effectively got multiple releases that you're having to support. What's the cost of that? And that's also something to, at least, if you and your founders are on the same page, that, yep, we're going to incur that cost, but man, the margins that we're making on this product business is just insane. Okay. Then maybe, separate the businesses, shield them from each other, and try to get as much of the consulting work injected back into the product business, but be clear you know, that some things just may never, you know, make their way into that world, and that's okay.
Mark?
Yeah.
So we're about 15 minutes to the end. We might be able to go over a little if people are interested, but a couple of questions I wanted to get in during this period. First of all, my experience has been that we don't design things for support, which could be a significant cost. So how do you do that, and at what stage do you start to think about that and code for that, or build out a support, you know, infrastructure with people or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that's a great topic on its own. I think what I've seen work really well is getting that, for lack of a better way to describe it, is getting that test-driven mindset, user-driven mindset from the get-go. If you're going to build a feature, you got to have a test case and documentation with that feature. It's not something that, you know, we're going to get to at some point. If you're a, you know, technical offering, you know, and you provide an API that people are going to use, make sure that, you know, it's very well documented, easy to understand. The same thing goes for, you know, things like onboarding, you know, for whatever the app is that you're building. Onboarding users, you know, has historically been one of the most expensive support areas. So there's a great example where, you know, having a test-driven experience where you're able to test a multitude of, is it browsers, is it devices, is it operating systems, and so on, so that you can account for all of these nuances, or as many of these nuances as possible. And then once again, when it comes down to analytics, you'll know what that share of browser, device, language, geography, bandwidth, the multitude of things that go into influencing that testing matrix. And once again, using analytics to inform how that testing matrix is evolving, I think is very important. And tests with documentation, not, you know, we've tested it, as in a developer tested it, ran on his machine or her machine, and we're good. No, what's the matrix, and who's validated, you know, that the devices, the browsers, the bandwidth constraint, and so on are all part of that. And that's once again where I think analytics plays a very important role. And by doing that, I think you radically reduce, you know, the number of potential support touch points, which end up being very costly, as I'm sure you can all relate to, especially with the launch of a new product. And even there, you know, if you have you know, some kind of ticketing system that you're using, which I highly encourage, you know, starting to look at hotspots on where you're getting the most, you know, number of support tickets. What are you doing to build the documentation and increase the test cases to include whatever was missed and so on? I think that also becomes a very important part of the roadmap, so as to have as little overhead from a support perspective as possible.
Okay, thanks. We have one more question. I'm not sure you'll be able to answer this. I might be able to add something, but it has to do with the different skill sets and different approaches between producing a software product or a hardware product of some sort.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing that's different is manufacturing. You know, in the world the startup that I run right now, you know, we manufacture a medical device, and that's a completely different world. You know, understanding different kinds of molds, different kinds of materials, how you're going to pack those things and then ship those things so that they don't get deformed or whatever. Whole nother world. Of course, you can, you know, learn as you go. but there are also, highly skilled people out there who've done this before. And I think, trying to leverage, people who are good at hardware versus people who are good at software, is very important. And then trying to have a lot of overlap between those worlds where, you're doing thorough testing and trying to explore a variety of different scenarios. I think, not just assuming, that things are going to work because one person tested it. I think the same applies in both worlds.
Right. Well, I think I can add a little bit here. I think if we're talking about an electronic device, something that plugs into a PC or a USB device or an independent device, I guess the first analogy that I would draw is that there is prototyping and wireframing, and you're going to have some sort of breadboarding to develop your MVP and be able to share it with people. And that's certainly not going to be anything that looks like a final product. And then there are a lot of tools out there, either for 3D building, 3D printing, and also router applications that'll cut your PC boards and things like that when you get to a later stage. Plenty of them out there. I'd actually advise people to look on the Make magazine site for that stuff. It's a wealth of resources.
But
okay.
Same rules apply. From an analytics perspective, you want to try to capture as much as possible. For example, if you're building a band that is used to to track or monitor individuals, being able to track temperature, humidity, moisture, as much as possible, so that when something breaks or doesn't work or whatever the scenario is, you've got the data to potentially rewind back, and try to uncover, what might have contributed, to something not working. The same thing goes if you're having, to pair a band with a mobile app, a mobile phone, trying to understand where there might have been pairing issues, phone models, app versions, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, understanding all of that, having something to capture that is also important, as opposed to, oh, it failed, we got the notification that it failed, now we got to call the customer and so on.
Okay.
Next question
was
go ahead.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Next question was around balancing intellectual property versus not revealing too much from a competitive perspective and so on. So a couple of things here is, one, how are you validating potential IP infringement? There are now great tools. Google's done a great job, especially on software patents, but they're great tools to be able to sift through the US trademark and patent database. But if you're building something and you don't know whether or not you might potentially infringe on someone's IP, I think that's potentially cause for concern. I think it's important to try to understand what might be out there and where you might be infringing. Having said that, when it comes to IP infringement, most of the folks who really care about this, care about it when they've really got something to go after. And that means, you've got critical mass. So I think it's very important to do the due diligence, but also I think it's, it's something that you need to balance, and not necessarily use it as something to put you off. There are 1,000,001 things that we could come up with that would put us off from doing something. I think due diligence around IP is important, and then making sound judgments around that. One of the approaches that I've had is, since IP attorneys are probably the most highest paid attorneys out there, is you can actually be quite creative and interview a bunch. And this is something that I did where, when the time that approached to build this medical device, I didn't, know much about the space. I didn't want to spend thousands of dollars on an IP attorney, so I spent some time on the US trademark and patent website, typing in all the terms and whatnot that I could figure out, and then also doing reverse searches against competitors where I knew a certain competitor, has products. If I sort by that competitor, I can start seeing what patents have been filed, and that's a great way to just narrow down the scope. Once I had learned a lot about what can and what can't be patented, or what is or what isn't patented or trademarked, I then hopped on the phone and started calling a variety of lawyers that specialize in this space, and used it as a way to interview and to get more detail on some of the nuances around this. And within a couple of weeks, without paying a cent, I was able to get right down to the specific thing that in the medical device world that I needed a trademark, not patent. And it became a very straightforward process, very cost effective, to then be able to do. So just, some food for thought. There are also, many founders out there who've done this before, so also trying to tap into that community, I think is, something that shouldn't be overlooked. It could also be pretty powerful, especially for, founders in a similar space. There's a concern from a competitor perspective, should I be worried about releasing something too soon? I kind of passed the question back, which is, what's your real concern here? And if you fast forward 12 months after releasing, is your concern going to be reduced? And if so, why? What would have changed? Would you have felt more comfortable that, is it because you got 1,000 customers or 100 customers, 10,000, 100,000? Is there something about adoption that might change that? The reason why I pose this question is, once again, I think as humans, we'll naturally come up with 1,000,001 reasons not to do something because we're afraid of failure and so on. But I think, the competitive angle, yeah, maybe valid, but I think more often than not is so far down on the list, because at the end of the day, if you spend 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, already working on solving a problem, building a business plan, building wireframes, identifying customers, user stories, competitive analysis, fundraising, blah, 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 you already have, some advantage against anyone, that might be entering in the space. The reality is once you've released something, it's fair game, right? Because, thanks to a lot of the frameworks that were introduced by the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, pretty much all code is now client-side, which means source code is free. You can pretty much go and, view anyone's app, view the source code, and you've got the, keys to the kingdom. But it takes more than just writing a bunch of code to solve a problem. And that's why, in the past couple of sessions, I try to, be pretty, vocal about the fact that writing code should be one of the last things that you do. There's all this other stuff that's important to do to ensure that you have a very buttoned up plan. Once you have a buttoned up plan, then it's super easy to be able to execute, write code, get out there, iterate and evolve.
I think that's the perfect note for us to finish on. So I would like to, we have one question we didn't get to. If the person who asked that would like to stay on for a few more minutes, I guess, Mark, do you have time to answer it?
Sure.
Okay. So we'll go for another 5 minutes and see if there are any other questions, and then wrap up.
Cool. And for the rest of folks, emails at the beginning of the slide. So, feel free to reach out, keep the conversation going. Happy to help in whatever way makes sense. What's the other question?
The last one you had about scaling the
Oh,
MVP.
gotcha. I thought someone
Yeah.
asked the question. So the other question that someone had asked was, how do I scale my MVP? So, just some thoughts. The one is around quantitative surveys. And I know I probably sound pretty repetitive, but research is a phenomenal tool to have in your toolbox. Once you have users, especially once you have more than 100, we start to get to a world where doing quantitative surveys becomes somewhat more statistically significant. Less than 100, less so, especially in terms of 100 responses. So I highly recommend, doing quantitative surveys, where you start to kind of ask customers insightful questions about whether or not the problem that you're solving actually satisfies them, how they might do something differently, other things that they might consider adding that you maybe hadn't considered adding, or maybe in terms of prioritization hadn't necessarily prioritized as high as maybe someone might have at that moment in time. So a huge tool to use throughout the life cycle. And I think the feedback from that very much helps inform the next step from an MVP perspective. What are the next set of features that I need to add? Or even, do I have the right set of features? Am I going after the right set of customers? More often than not, some of the assumptions we make early on, tend to require some type of shift in direction. The sooner we can validate, are we going after the right customers, solving the right problems in the right way? The sooner we can validate that and actually be open to validating that, as opposed to validating what we want validated, which is more common than not, I think is hugely helpful in shifting an MVP that may have small adoption to the next iteration that gets even more adoption. The next is also on the research topic, is around qualitative research, and picking up the phone, doing some type of webcast with a customer where they walk you through how they're using the app is huge. We demonstrated a couple of tools like Crazy Egg and Hotjar. There's no shortage of tools out there, which you can just, once again, plug into your website with very little code and start to capture how users are using your web app as well as your mobile apps, and starting to get some heat maps on where people are clicking and what they're clicking on, where they're scrolling. I think also helps provide some insights into how users are using your product and what specifically they're using. So maybe you've made a set of assumptions that said, features 5, 6, and 7 are the things that we think are going to be least adopted. But maybe, through an exercise like that, it turns out that features 5, 6, and 7 are actually the ones that are the most used, and features 1, 2, and 3 are the least used. That's why I think having some type of analytics, not just raw usage data, but some type of like heat mapping data that shows what people are using and where they're clicking and whatnot, I think is helpful in providing insights in that regard, and is not necessarily a replacement for hopping on conference calls, web conference calls, with customers and seeing for real how customers are using your app. And I think that's also a great way to evolve an MVP, where you've got some new ideas and some thoughts that you're thinking of, wireframe them out very quickly, and then hop on a call with some customers and watch them, click on screen and ask questions, ask feedback. Why do you do that? As opposed to, guiding them through the process. It's important to, when it comes to user research, is to let the customer use the tool in the way that they think they should use the tool. Additionally, just last point, is around, creative growth hacking. So, maybe you've got a great MVP out there, you've got a couple of thousand users, I'd be asking, how do I double, triple that user base? And why? So that you can get more data, more insights, and evolve and tweak and improve the story so that what you're iterating, in terms of the plan for the next release becomes, validated in real world data as opposed to internal, I know better than customer data. Cool. With that, any other questions?
Looks like not. So, Mark, thank you very much.
No problem.
And thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm going to paste one more time the link to the survey. So please do that. We'd appreciate it very much, and it's very much in tune with Mark's emphasis about analytics.